I swear if I see another Kickstarter where the main playable races are elf, dwarf, and human, I'm going to slay something. J.R.R. Tolkien's legacy looms large in the fantasy genre. Maybe too large sometimes. It seems that in the sci-fi genre one can do almost anything, go anywhere, be anyone. But fantasy seems to have this tendency to fall into certain tropes about the way its kingdoms, characters, villains, and heroes are supposed to look and act. Along with orcs and dragons, the holy quadrangle of human, elf, dwarf, and hobbit were codified in the game Dungeons & Dragons, which later had to change the name to halfling for legal reasons, but we all know they're hobbits. In turn, D&D helped inspire a whole host of games by both Eastern and Western developers, starting back with games like Zork and Dragon Quest, up to more recent games like Skyrim or Dragon's Dogma, and even whole other genres of games like MMOs, Ultima Online, EverQuest, World of Warcraft, and early roguelikes. I could be here all day, but I'm not here to talk about any of those games. Instead, I want to talk about how one might try to literally adapt Tolkien and make an amazing and faithful Lord of the Rings game. So how does one go about adapting someone who literally wrote the book on the genre? I don't know, but somehow I don't think it's going to be as easy as simply walking into Mordor. Welcome to the first ever episode of the Wireless Game Adapter Podcast. On this podcast, what I want to do is look at properties that are not games and figure out how do we make games out of those things. So, the format has 4 parts, named after ideas in Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey because I'm a pretentious git. So in the first part, we're going to talk a little bit about the property itself, what makes it tick, describe it for people that might not be familiar, and some of its important themes and aspects. In the second part, we're going to discuss actual adaptations, both video games and tabletop games, or any other sort of game that might have been made with this property. It won't be a completely exhaustive list, but I'll try to be fairly comprehensive. In the third part, I'm going to discuss games that weren't specifically trying to adapt the work, but that I personally feel captured certain important aspects of the property. And finally, in the fourth part, we're going to bring it all together and try to figure out what would actually go into the perfect Lord of the Rings game, and whether it's best suited to be a tabletop game, or a video game, or a game in some other media. I mean, this is a world that has Lord of the Rings LARPers. The sky's the limit. So, in the immortal words of Gandalf the Grey, who, little known fact, J.R.R. Tolkien named after my cat, fly you fools, you're listening to the Wireless Game Adapter Podcast. Part 1. Crossing the Threshold. In the Third Age of Middle-earth, the hobbits Frodo and Sam, and a sausage-fest of heroes, take a magic ring on a quest to destroy it in the fires of Mount Doom, in an attempt to thereby defeat the Dark Lord Sauron. But of course, that's not even close to the whole story, is it? In the beginning there was Eru Ilúvatar, and he created the Valar and the Maiar. The Valar would sing the world into existence. Okay, so I'm not going to try to summarize the entire mythology of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings series in this podcast, because I'm sure there's other podcasts that have done that, and I don't have the energy or knowledge or stamina or nerd cred. But it's indisputable that Tolkien helped pioneer the idea of world building. The notion that one could create an entire separate universe within a work, one that lives and breathes outside of the main protagonist's actions. This concept wasn't invented by Tolkien. Other writers like H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard were playing around with these sorts of ideas decades previously. But Tolkien certainly took it a step further, inventing whole histories and entirely fictional languages for his world's inhabitants. He pulled a lot of his ideas from existing English folklore and developed them with a writing group that sounds quite similar to the development playtest groups that I use to design tabletop games. One of the members of this group was his good friend C.S. Lewis, and I think it's fair to say that the Chronicles of Narnia mythology is all the richer for their friendship. Not everyone in the group was as supportive of their ideas for adult fairy tales. During an early reading of what eventually became The Lord of the Rings, another member of the group is alleged to have remarked, "Oh God, not another fucking elf." But my point is, the idea of a living, breathing fantasy world that exists outside of the player's knowledge and actions is, I think, perhaps the central idea of Lord of the Rings, or at least a central idea that any proper game adaptation needs to try to get across. In practical terms, this means not just having a big wide world to explore, but also giving the sense that the world and its inhabitants exist without the player's presence. In addition to this, we need to include themes of bravery and sacrifice, high stakes, and most importantly of all, temptation. Temptation, corruption, and the fallibility of power and ambition feature heavily in Tolkien's work. We have characters such as Gollum and Boromir who are tempted by the One Ring, Saruman who is tempted to join with Sauron, and characters such as Denethor and the Ringwraiths. Even the dwarves are tempted. The Balrog, after all, was released because they mined too greedily and too deep. The hobbits are capable of becoming the hero of Tolkien's story because they lack ambition. Essentially, they sit around on their porch all day, smoking their pipe, baking pies, and generally having a hobbity time. This makes them ideal candidates for saving the world. Although it's worth noting that in the end, even Frodo starts to feel the temptation of that sweet, sweet ring. Part 2: The Road of Trials. One of the biggest problems that developers have had trying to adapt the story of Lord of the Rings over the years is that secrets and characters making bad choices are very important to the narrative. One example of this problem in effect is the 1977 tabletop war game, War of the Ring. This game recreates in painstaking detail the stats and geography of Middle-earth and its inhabitants and their various military powers. The problem is, the Sauron player knows exactly how the heroes are going to win. They need to bring the ring to Mount Doom and destroy it. And so, the game inevitably devolves into a giant all-star blowout atop Mount Doom, which, while I'm sure awesome, doesn't really emulate any details of the source material. This is not dissimilar to the problem in Axis and Allies where a savvy German player with 20/20 hindsight won't bother wasting a bunch of resources trying to wage an aerial war against Britain. Obviously, if Hitler knew what he was doing, he would have used Nazgul. I will say that this War of the Ring compares favorably to the Hobbit board game released in the same year. A simple and dull roll-and-move game belies one of the strangest and most eye-wateringly terrible games I have ever encountered. To win, players attempt to acquire gold, which is mostly gained by making it to Smaug's lair along the track. However, making it to Smaug's lair does not grant you anywhere near enough gold to actually win, and so the game involves making dozens and dozens of treks from the Shire to Smaug's lair. However, the path is paved with dangers that will rob you of your gold. I played this game for about 2 hours, and all players were farther from winning the game than when they started, creating a sort of Sisyphean purgatory. In addition, the few choices that the game tries to present are just bizarre. At one point, you have the option of acquiring a shield for 100 gold pieces. Later on, you encounter a space that says, pay 100 gold pieces, or discard a shield if you have it. There are several items that seem to function this way, with no other purpose. I'm not sure if David Lynch was involved with this game in some capacity, but I'm fairly convinced that it should be banned by the Geneva Convention. Things improve considerably in the tabletop space when Rainer Knizia comes along with 2 pretty awesome games. His 2000 game, simply titled Lord of the Rings, pioneered the genre of fully cooperative board games, and it emulates several aspects of the source material quite well. particularly the aspect of sacrifice. There is player elimination, and it's very likely that a Hobbit player will have to sacrifice themselves to the darkness at some point to save their party. Of course, this holds a little bit less weight since it is fully cooperative and all players have the exact same goal. So it's sacrifice in the way that a bee stinging somebody is a sacrifice, but it still works. The game also draws on the deep well of inspiring Lord of the Rings graphical artists. You see, board games before the year 2000 were all legally required to visually resemble reheated turds. One thing that baffles me about this game is that they needed a fifth Hobbit, and instead of perhaps adding a female playable character, they added a male Hobbit named Fatty. Because when I think heroic high fantasy, I really want to play a Hobbit named Fatty. Moving on. Just 2 years later, Knizia graced us with Lord of the Rings The Confrontation, which is kind of like Stratego on steroids. And Stratego is perfect for steroids because all of the stats of your pieces are hidden. Rather than just wiping out your enemy forces, the goal of the heroes is to deliver Frodo and the One Ring to Mount Doom, and the villains need only capture Frodo to win. Depending on how things shake out, the confrontation can actually capture the mood, bravery, and sacrifice of the source material quite well. Amusingly, Boromir's power is to die, because, spoiler alert, he is basically the only character who dies, probably because Tolkien knew he would be played by Sean Bean. Sometimes, depending on players' choices, things can shake out in a less faithful fashion. For example, in one game, I had both Frodo and Sam horribly mauled because the Balrog attacked the Shire before they'd decided to get on the road yet. For the record, I have no objection to this scenario. This is probably one of my favorite two-player games. Around the same time, to sort of coincide with Peter Jackson's film trilogy, we got a Games Workshop miniature game which had a lot of dice chucking but was pretty good and represented combat between high-powered heroes and massed infantry quite effectively. Then we got a new board game called War of the Ring. This one did a much better job of handling the whole Mount Doom problem. The Fellowship's movement is hidden. The shadow player must expend resources to attempt to hunt for the ring bearers, and the good guys must decide whether their heroes will protect Frodo or rally the free peoples to fight. Once the Fellowship reaches Mordor, the whole mechanic is completely abstracted, and they simply progress along a track and cannot be interacted with by the military of Sauron. So the hindsight problem is basically sidestepped by simply not allowing Sauron to mass his forces around the mouth of Mount Doom. Overall, it's a good military strategy game with an interesting dice action mechanism and arguably the high water point of tabletop adaptations of this source material. Though personally, I still prefer wrecking up the Shire with the Balrog. So how does the video game arena fare in comparison? Well, likewise, we have a bunch of high points and some low points, though mercifully none quite so low as that 1977 Hobbit board game. There were a smattering of adventure games before the millennia that I haven't played, some of the Zork variety, but the floodgates really opened with Peter Jackson's film trilogy. In 2002, we got a PC game called The Fellowship of the Ring from Surreal Software, which is a fitting title because there's something about this game that's just off. I'm not sure how to describe it. It sort of feels like the kind of game that you'd get out of a cereal box, but it wasn't terrible. Later, Stormfront Studios, previously known for a bunch of sports games, managed to get the movie license and pumped out 2 console video games that were quite good, The Two Towers and Return of the King. These were fairly straightforward hack and slash games that didn't necessarily have that much in common with the source material of Tolkien, but were fairly good adaptations of the Peter Jackson films in a sort of cinematic and aesthetic sense. The combat is definitely more satisfying here than in the game that came out a few years afterwards called Aragorn's Quest, It was that awkward period where developers thought that waggling a Wiimote instead of pressing a button was somehow way more immersive, but it gets a bit tiring when you swing your sword for the 40,000th time, compared to the extremely satisfying swordplay in No More Heroes, released the same year, which understood to use the motion controls sparingly for emphasis. Using waggles for all of your button presses is sort of like trying to write an action scene with nothing but curse words and exclamation marks. Later we had Lord of the Rings Conquest. I was pretty pumped as it was the spiritual successor to the Battlefront franchise. And it sucked. Then there was the Battle for Middle-earth, which came at the end of the sort of life cycle of traditional RTS games. But it was actually really awesome, with interesting differences between the different playable races, and a super epic feel where you could carry your armies over from scenario to scenario, which encouraged intelligent tactics even in the end game rather than just tossing all of your troops into the enemy base. Speaking of ill-fated utilizations of resources, let's talk about one of the MMOs that came out in the wake of World of Warcraft, Lord of the Rings Online. Now, in some ways, the source material really is a good fit for an MMO, because MMOs have to be about world building. I've heard that the game is a bit grindy, like most MMOs, but to be fair, half of the books are literally about two people walking through Mordor, chapter after chapter, and eating bread. Anyway, we were eventually graced with the game Shadow of Mordor, which I would call the high watermark of the video game adaptations of this material. The main storyline is functional, but what is really exciting is the Nemesis system, where if an enemy defeats you in battle, they will actually gain power and rise the ranks in the orc hierarchy, and each orc has a unique randomly generated personality, so you'll end up with these long-running beefs with certain orcs that just keep getting tougher and tougher for defeating you, and it just feels so satisfying to finally take them down in some unique way by playing off their weaknesses or fears. It actually really inspires me about the potential for games to engage our emotions with procedurally generated content. Something about the orcs being your own random special orcs makes it feel more personal than if they were just one of those handcrafted corporate orcs. In fact, I would say that Shadow of Mordor might be the game that best captures the emotion of vengeance, which is quite common in literature, but isn't really part of the Lord of the Rings story so much. There aren't really a whole bunch of bad guys that we deal with and get to know in that personal way. None of the heroes are really motivated by revenge, but the Nemesis system and the fun-to-traverse open world do get across that idea of a living, breathing place that continues to exist without the player's presence. Also, you eventually unlock the ability to control your foes' minds, essentially turning the game into orc Pokemon. What's not to love? The last game I want to bring up is called Lord of the Rings: The Third Age, and I'm bringing it up not because it's particularly interesting. It's a mediocre RPG where you play as off-brand versions of the heroes from the books and films. It's not particularly bad, notable, or weird until you get to the final section where you will literally do battle, Final Fantasy style, against the literal Eye of Sauron atop his tower. Now that is how you jump the shark. Although I suppose you could just watch Peter Jackson's Hobbit films. Part 3. Transformation. Here's the part where I talk about some games that aren't specifically licensed on Lord of the Rings or even have much of anything to do with Lord of the Rings, but which I feel capture some important aspect of the source material. For the first example, I'm going back to Halo 1, Combat Evolved, and not just because it takes place on a ring world, hardy har. Specifically, there are several points in the game where you find yourself caught in the crossfire between huge armies of Flood and Covenant forces. This really mirrors several specific points in the Lord of the Rings story, and also gets the idea across that you exist in this greater world where forces are battling around you, and yet you have the potential to swing the balance. Now, of course, Frodo didn't mow down hundreds of orcs while Sam drove him around on his warthog, but nobody's perfect. There are a number of board and card games that get across the idea of temptation quite well with push your luck style mechanics. For example, in the game Ink and Gold, you and your friends are exploring an ancient Incan tomb, attempting to gather as many gems as possible. But if you delve too greedily and too deep, you're gonna get screwed over by giant spiders. In Cleopatra and the Society of Architects, you and your rival architects are attempting to build the most beautiful palace, but you are frequently tempted to take shortcuts, and in the end, the most corrupt architect will be fed to the crocodiles. For example, you receive 1 corruption for using smuggled timber, 2 corruption for bribing the palace scribe, and 5 corruption for leveling Fanghorn Forest in order to build an army of Urukai. All sorts of games try to get across the idea of exploration and discovery, but it's surprisingly easy to do this wrong and make exploration feel like a chore or simply meaningless. 2 of the games that I really feel nail it are the PC game Minecraft and the Nintendo game Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. In both of these games, you aren't swamped with a whole bunch of icons on a mini-map. Instead, you are given this open world where if you want to see what's over that mountain, it's simply a matter of loading up with enough supplies and making your way. Regularly making organic choices about whether to sneak through that enemy camp or avoid it by going through the treacherous pass. But I can't really recommend shortcutting through the mines of Moria, friend. The critically acclaimed Journey for PlayStation 3 has a mythological feel and takes place in a world in a transitory state where you are exploring ancient ruins of lost empires. It also has a lot of walking. And the last game I want to touch on is another indie video game called Bastion. It's a great game with a couple of really fantastic character moments. But the really interesting part is the narrator that describes every little thing that the player is doing, whether it be simply breaking a few pots or falling off a cliff. It all gets sort of mythologized. Every little action and moment feels like it's part of something bigger. Part 4. The Elixir. So here's the part where we try to distill what we've learned and try to understand what would really have to go into the perfect Lord of the Rings game. And I just want to start off by saying that much as I love some of the tabletop games, I don't feel like it's possible to really do the source material justice without making it some sort of immersive video game experience. In the book, he will literally spend a couple of sentences to describe the entire courtship and relationship of Aragorn and Arwen, yet happily spend a couple of pages describing the grass on some random hill, which is a little odd, but it shows how important those little details of Middle-earth are. Another important thing is the music. The books are littered with dozens of epic poems and songs, so we really need to engage all the senses on this one, maybe even with a VR headset or something. As to whether we're looking at a single-player or multiplayer game, there are certainly lots of themes of friendship, fellowship, and loyalty in the source material, but it's difficult to really nail that in an online game. It's hard for me to feel a sense of fellowship when my teammate is a 9-year-old shouting about how my mom is gay. So I think if you're going to try to do multiplayer, it has to be either offline couch co-op, or you do something like Journey, where players are very limited in how they can communicate with one another. There also need to be non-player characters that act like they belong in the world. I want to see armies clashing and living agents with their own agendas. One element that we really haven't seen done is that idea of temptation. Morality systems in games tend to suck. Part of the problem is that there aren't really any benefits to being evil a lot of the time, and so the choice isn't very compelling. In Fable 1, All it being evil really got you was a cool sword right at the end when you couldn't actually do anything with it. The re-release, Fable The Lost Chapters, added a few extra levels where you could theoretically use this awesome sword, but then it gave you a completely analogous, good awesome sword for being a moral person and not taking the nearly identical evil awesome sword, rendering the whole thing moot. Our Lord of the Rings game needs to tempt players to do corrupt actions for tangible short-term benefits while risking long-term narrative or mechanic harm. And it needs to be substantial enough where it's actually tempting and where you basically could not win the game without giving into the darkness at some point a little bit. This might also require a save system that doesn't allow the player to simply save scum their way through a specific encounter by reloading the game a whole bunch of times. The PC gamer's equivalent to the One Ring of Power. Quick load to win them all and quick save to bind them. Of course, our game doesn't actually have to take place during the whole Ring saga. I would say it probably shouldn't. It's hard to evoke the feeling of discovery when this is such well-trod ground, and you have skull-crushing reams of material to work with. In addition, I want lots of narration, whether from a narrator or from the characters themselves. The game needs to focus on the small things, like eating lambas bread, crossing a specific valley, trying to take on a specific enemy camp, acquiring that one random special item with more backstory than my D&D character. And the characters of the narrator need to comment on this stuff. I also, and this is important, I want characters to sing and be merry. I want them to sing me songs about the butterflies and the trees and the gosh darn ballad of Bilbo Baggins, bravest little hobbit of them all. When things in Middle-earth look their darkest and bleakest, I need characters to pick up my spirits with a song, because there is good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. And finally, I need to be able to explore this wonderful, infinitely influential place without a bunch of arrows and radars and objective and quest markers. I don't need a minimap to tell me orcs are approaching. I know because my blade is glowing blue. And I know because this is Middle-earth, and it's always fucking orcs. You've been listening to the Wireless Game Adapter Podcast, hosted by me, Orin Bishop. Check out Steampunk Rally and many other great games at roxley.com. Music in this episode was grabbed from incompetech.com under the Creative Commons license. Snippets of The Descent and Hero Down, both by Kevin MacLeod. The theme music is Chibi Ninja by Eric Skiff. Leave me more feedback on this episode or tell me what you want adapted next by going to orinbishop.wixsite.com/gamedesign and follow me on facebook.com/orinbishopgames. Don't keep it secret and keep it safe. Tell a friend about this podcast, or whisper it to a kindly passing moth.